Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything.
Hello, friends. Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Katie, and it is my pleasure to walk through 2 Corinthians with you in our year-long study of the New Testament. Today, we are studying 2 Corinthians 11. As always, you can follow along with the Behold studies in the Daily Grace Co. shop or with the reading plan linked in the show notes. Have you ever watched or listened to a parody? Perhaps a song or a skit on a television show? According to Webster's dictionary, parodies imitate the style of a person, writer, or artist with a deliberate exaggeration for comedic effect. In chapter 11, Paul writes a parody of his own. He parodies the foolish arguments of false apostles. They boast in their strength and in a gospel other than Christ. And Paul will continue to boast in his weakness and in Jesus' gospel alone. Paul gets quite cheeky today, but we must remember why he is so passionate about defending his ministry and defending the gospel. Paul seeks to protect the Corinthians from placing their faith in anyone but Jesus. Paul protects the Corinthians out of love. In fact, in verse 2, Paul describes himself as being jealous with a godly jealousy. At first glance, the words godly and jealousy may seem to contradict each other. But actually, several times in the Old Testament, God calls himself jealous. He is jealous for his people's affection. For example, in Deuteronomy 6:14 and 15, Moses tells Israel, "Do not follow other gods, the gods of the peoples around you, for the Lord your God is among you. He is a jealous God." So too, Paul seeks to protect the Corinthians from false teachers. He wants them to be completely devoted to Christ. They have already been chosen as a bride of their husband Jesus. Chasing after another gospel would be like a bride chasing after another man. Apparently, these false teachers were proclaiming another Jesus, another gospel, another spirit. We aren't quite sure what these other gospels entailed, but we do know that likely their speech was strong and eloquent and convincing. And Paul takes great effort to return the Corinthians' affections to Christ. He mocks these false teachers by calling them super apostles. As we studied yesterday in chapter 10, some opponents doubted Paul's authority because he was gentle and meek in person but bold in his letters. Paul even admits today that he is untrained in public speaking. But Paul's point is that the words are shallow. Eloquence can be deceitful. Paul lived out the gospel he proclaimed. He has taken great care that his actions toward the Corinthians point them to Christ. He has lowered himself to elevate them. He has refused financial support from them so that the grace of Jesus would be free on all accounts. Paul has kept himself from burdening the Corinthians. Why? Why would Paul go to such lengths to labor for the Corinthians through trial after trial, misunderstanding after misunderstanding? Why would Paul keep correcting the Corinthians? Why didn't he just give up? In verses 10 and 11, he says it's because of his love for the Corinthians. He longs for them to share in his love, to be united to him as brothers and sisters in Christ. That's why he defends his ministry. That's why he's cheeky against opponents today, because of his zeal for their salvation, because of his love for this church. And so Paul continues his warnings about these so-called super apostles. They claim to have authority as great as Paul's, and yet Paul calls them false apostles and deceitful workers. They claim to be working for Christ, but really they are disguised servants of Satan. In Galatians 1, Paul will plainly warn, "If anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you have received, a curse be on him." Paul's authority lies not in his words, but in Christ. Christ is the one who met Paul on Damascus Road and chose him to bring good news to the Gentiles. If the super apostles have anything to boast about, Paul has more reason. From a worldly point of view, Paul too is a Hebrew. He's an Israelite, a descendant from Abraham, a servant of Christ. His spiritual resume surpasses theirs because Paul preaches a gospel not just with his words, but with his actions. Paul imitates his life after Christ. Paul boasts in his weakness. This is Paul's spiritual resume, that he's endured imprisonments, beatings, near-death experiences, lashings, stonings, sleepless nights, and even a shipwreck. And all the while, Paul endures a heavy burden of concern for the churches he's planted, including the Corinthians. Paul's endured all this and more to make Christ known. Paul parodies the super apostles' claims to authority. They boast in their eloquence and spiritual intellect. Paul boasts in his sufferings. Christ is proven in Paul's willingness to endure whatever comes his way for the gospel's sake. His ministry is a ministry of integrity. His life an arrow pointing to Jesus. Paul's parody reminds us that the resume of a Christian should look far different than the world's. It's not about how well we climb the corporate ladder, the wealth we accumulate, or even the good of the person we were. The top of a Christian's resume is child of God, citizen of heaven, ambassador of Christ, and anything underneath it should proclaim Christ's kingdom, a kingdom that is far different than the world. Today, we behold Jesus as King of Kings, King of his upside-down kingdom, the King who came to serve, who kneeled to wash his disciples' feet, the sinless Son of God who dined with tax collectors and sinners, the friend who was betrayed and yet prayed on the cross, "Father, forgive them because they know not what they're doing." Jesus shows us what it means to live upside down. May we too, like Paul, follow in his footsteps today.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.